Welcome to the Contrarian Capitalist podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today by Joel Bowman, who you might know from Notes from the End of the World, based on Substack. All links will be in the notes that come with the podcast as well. Joel, nice to spend some time with you today. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, mate. Thanks for having me on your show, and hello to your readers slash listeners. Is it Mr. Capitalist, Mr. Contrarian? How should I refer to you during the
You
episode?
just call me Rob. That's absolutely fine. That's,
Robert, okay.
absolutely fine. Joel, really looking forward to this because we touched base. I think it was about 4 or 5 weeks ago because you were hosting a virtual conference about potential opportunities down there in Argentina. So that's how we came across. All I've got written on my notes, and I don't normally make notes for these podcasts, but because of where you're based, all I've got written down here is Javier Milei cryptocurrency. Where on earth do we start with this? How do we make sense of what may or may not have happened with the Argentinian president?
Right. Well, I mean, as is usually the case with all things political and market-based down here, we may never know. It's a very, as we were speaking off air just a second ago, it's whatever happens in the rest of the world, it seems like Argentina just do it sort of to 10x. So as you mentioned, we had a conference I had for my readers about 5 weeks ago called Investing in the End of the World, and we had a few special guests on that one: Rick Rule, Eric Fry, Byron King, and we were talking, just to back up a little bit, we were talking about some very positive economic data coming out of Argentina after Javier Milei's first year or first 14 months or so in office. Things like inflation being beaten down, the poverty rate had fallen a lot, the country's risk index was sort of looking like it was headed in the right direction, and generally things were just kind of moving along in the way that in the way that you'd hope for an economy to be moving along after coming off a huge hyperinflationary scare in late 2023. And so, yeah, all of the guests were kind of in agreement that they were looking for some political stability down here. The geology, they'd been investing here for 40 odd years apiece, so over a century collectively. They had lots of experience with various investments and opportunities down here. And what they really wanted to see was the political landscape kind of shore up and to get some stability and predictability. Fast forward a few weeks, and because nothing is boring down here at the end of the world, we have what you alluded to at the top of your question there, which is Milei cryptocurrency. Where do we begin? And so last Friday, to just kind of put this in a nutshell, there was a meme coin, a kind of token launched down here called Libra, which Javier Milei had shared on his Twitter feed. And to be clear, this is a kind of a Twitter feed where it's hard to keep up. There's 100 things that are reposted and shared on it, and on a kind of hourly basis. And he's made a point to sort of share all and any news related to Argentina in the past. Anyway, the coin went to something like 4.2 or $4.4 billion worth of market cap, and then quickly dropped 95% or something like that. So immediately, of course, the internet sort of lights up with, was this a rug pull? Was this a scam coin? Was this to what extent is the president involved or not? And that kind of sort of bled into the weekend's news cycle, where people were left, people in the know, I would say, who were kind of crypto literate or who follow that space, were sort of biting their nails for a little while. But I will say, on the flip side of that, the 99.7% of the population that are sort of, for whom this doesn't really concern, they were sort of blissfully unaware and or didn't care. And so you kind of got this bifurcation of the population, where sort of crypto bros were looking at this and digging and going back and forth with accusations and scuttlebutt and weighing up their kind of deep dives. And the rest of the Argentine population kind of gave it the you know, the kind of response that you would expect a thoroughly crisis resilient population to give, which was kind of a meh, we'll see. We don't really care. We're pretty used to this stuff down here, and certainly most of the people that I spoke to over the weekend, both who were sort of in and aware of this space, and those who this is just sort of another day in the life of Argentine politics. All of them sort of converged around this isn't great, but in a couple of weeks, it may well just be sort of yesterday's news, and they didn't seem too ruffled by it. That's obviously not to say that there's nothing there, and even as we're talking now, more sort of layers of the onion are coming off, and who knows what we'll find there. But it does appear to be one of those, at least at this stage, it appears to be one of those stories where I think people for whom lowering inflation and a healthier job market and purchasing power of their salary and lowering crime in their neighborhood, the kind of things, the kind of sort of touch points that people have in their day-to-day life, for people for whom that is much more important, it doesn't seem to have really moved the needle very much.
And that's fair enough. I mean, I know that you've done a recent post called Libertarians with a dollar sign at the start. Again, I'll tag that in the notes that come with this as well. And I think you made the point in there as well, where monthly inflation had come in at lower than expected in Argentina at 2.2%, and then the poverty or the poverty index rating, however it's worked out in Argentina, that was also down nearly 20 points as well. So when you're, dare I say, boots on the ground, actually the things that people probably want to see improving, to me, look like they're improving down there.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a place, as we were just speaking off air before we hit record here. This is a place where it can be the cheapest, one of the cheapest places to live in the Western Hemisphere because of these aberrations in their currency, and then swing to one of the most expensive places to live. They have these rolling sort of decennial crises. I think they've had 9 sovereign debt defaults, going back to the beginning of the 20th century, 3 alone in this century. So, it's not as if the people here are not sort of weathered, maybe even calloused toward, what they maybe perceive for rightly or wrongly as sort of noise in the media. And, to be frank, I'm not suggesting that this is, that I really know the ins and outs of what happened behind the scenes with this token, and certainly there are many red flags there. But just sort of looking at where the rubber meets the road for the average Argentine, things like cryptocurrency, the ins and outs of it, they're fairly esoteric concepts when compared to, can I put more food on my table for my family this time of the year than I could last time, during the last administration? The Argentines, one of the charming character aspects of the Argentine people that I just have really fallen in love with over my sort of 10 or 15 years on and off here in the country, is that they are naturally skeptical of all politicians. So unlike my country of birth in Australia, probably hear my accent, where people, they generally sort of look to their government as, being more or less champions of their best interest. And, they expect them maybe to be a little, prone to corruption here or there on a minor scale. But generally, the people's representatives are there to do the bidding of their constituents. Here, there's no such illusion, or delusion, rather. It's, they know exactly why politicians are in power, and it's to enrich themselves at the expense of the outsiders. So, they're quite used to this. Milei has been able to disrupt that narrative very effectively by positioning himself as a creature of neither the right nor the left. And so that was kind of how he was able to build such a strong coalition during the 2023 presidential election. And, the cynics among us here are not surprised that the scandals might start popping up during an election year. They get sort of magnified. They get blasted through the megaphone of news, that would like to see him taken down and a return to the status quo, as opposed to the status quo that was here before Milei sort of disrupted all the insiders' gravy trains. And those people would like nothing more than to see him fall on his own sword and for things to return to grift and corruption as usual. So, I mean, we'll have to see how it plays out. But as I wrote in mentioned on my notes from the end of the world Substack, there's never a dull day here in Argentina. If you're looking for predictability and stability, there's some lovely alpine European countries that you can pass some time in that are very well regulated, and everybody sort of mows their lawn in unison on a Sunday, and life is, just goes along exactly as you would expect. Down here, it's telenovela politics all the way. So yeah, that's kind of the nature of the beast.
I would imagine you could probably just pop across the Rio de la Plata as well and head off to Uruguay, where I read it's also quite a tranquil place from
Sleepy
traveling.
little Uruguay, yeah.
Yeah, I do love Uruguay. Bringing back travel memories, to be fair, Joel. But yeah, we're not here to digest on travel, although I could. And it's interesting looking at Argentina from the outside. I don't just say that with a British accent and all of that sort of stuff. Having recently moved to Mexico, I think as you just alluded to, I think politics there is also dealt with. Maybe it's a Latin thing. It's also dealt with a heavy dose of skepticism. We know why you're there. We know there's going to be corruption. What I found on a day-to-day basis so far is how decentralized day-to-day is in comparison to the UK. So, I can go about my business. I mean, I stick out like a sore thumb anyway, because it's just of the neighborhood where I'm in. So, there's not many people like me. And I refer to my skin color. So, I know I stick out from that point of view, but no one doesn't bother me. I'm not getting bothered on a day-to-day basis. You're just living your life. Cash is king, especially if you're buying X, Y, and Z. So I quite enjoy that. I had a similar impression of Argentina back in 2014, where it's chaotic, it's beautiful. I mean, the food's fantastic, the wine's fantastic. I found the people to be really warming, really friendly, and obviously there's a lot of natural resources, a lot of great things going on down there. If you don't mind, again, just go back to Javier Milei for a second. From your time in Argentina, what else have you seen, like from a practical point of view, what else have you seen him do where the people seem to be responding well to, if there is anything else he's done? I know there's Chainsaw 2.0, but boots on the ground, what else have you seen? What else has he brought to Argentina?
Yeah, well, just from a kind of day-to-day practical standpoint, in November, December of 2023, this was right before the presidential, or around the presidential election, in which Milei was elected with, I think, by the largest margin since Argentina was returned to democracy 40 odd years ago, after the flirtation with military dictatorship, or maybe tango with military dictatorship would be a better way to put it. So during those couple of months immediately preceding that electoral win, there were no prices on menus down here. You would go and sit in a restaurant and the prices were blank on the menu, because they would change while you were eating your meal. That's how fast inflation was changing the goods and services that you were being offered. Likewise, storekeepers didn't bother pricing any of the goods on their shelves, because by the time that they were priced in the morning, they would have to be repriced in the afternoon. So it was getting to that really unfortunately familiar stage where the money just starts melting away in people's hands. And so that causes all kinds of panic buying of, basically any real world asset, real sort of, tangible asset that people can get their hands on. So people would invest in everything from gold to crypto, all the way down to just bricks, just bare essential building material that they could store on their land, if they sort of lived out in the provinces, just so that it would be a store of wealth. So we're talking about some pretty, rudimentary, investment strategies when you're buying literally clay bricks just to preserve your wealth because your state is flushing it away via the printing press. So, that kind of thing has a very, very real world impact on people's psyche, not just their trust of their government, but also the kinds of decisions they make with regards to how to protect themselves against those incursions. They also had very, very strict capital controls. So Argentine citizens were forbidden from buying more than, I think it was $200 per month of foreign currency. So basically, they were trapped necessarily in, I mean, you talk about a rug pull. This was, if you have a look at the chart of the ARS, the Argentine peso against the US dollar over the past, from 2010 to today, it doesn't look very dissimilar from the chart of the Libra coin, albeit stretched over, a decade and a half. Although the key difference, of course, being that Argentine's 45 million people didn't have a choice not to be in the Argentine peso. It wasn't a kind of caveat emptor. This is some fringy, notoriously volatile meme coin. This was the state's currency, which is, had lost sort of 95+% of its value over the course of half a generation, which is criminal, I think. And so going from that, where there's 300% inflation per year, 25.5% per month, down to a level that we're at right now. You mentioned the inflation numbers for January came in lower than expected. It's down to 2.2% a month, down into double digits on an annualized basis. This essentially means people can save. They can start allocating their capital for commercial interests. They can keep inventory on their shelves. They can start planning for the future, which is, it seems to you and I, having grown up in the UK and Australia, that that's just something we take for granted, but that's a real luxury for people here. Along with that, I would say probably the biggest thing that you notice day to day is the constant deregulation of the economy. So there was a ministry of deregulation. It was kind of the proto-DOGE agency down here in Argentina, and I think I think that a lot of what Mrs. Musk and Trump are doing with regards to going in and sort of trying to weed out as best they can government inefficiency and waste and abuse and fraud and all that kind of stuff. The prototype of that was very much the Ministry of Deregulation down here, and headed up by Senor Stutzenegger in mid 2024. He essentially had gone through and was cutting, I think at one point it was over 2 regulations per day out of the federal government registry, and that includes weekends and holidays. So he and his team were really working around the clock. And practically for Argentines here, this means the lifting of really onerous import and export taxes that were really throttling local businesses and their ability to access imported goods at a real world price, whether it be that technology or textiles or whatever it happens to be. So just freeing up the markets, freeing up the labor regulations in the labor market, so that people could hire and fire their employees more easily, so that you can really sort of nurture a more dynamic labor market. There were 40,000 federal employees let go, with the promise of many, many more positions to be examined, audited, etc. And people took notice of these kinds of things, and I think for an economy that was around 45% of the GDP during Milei's election was consumed by the federal government, which is just an astronomical.
Wow.
The host had almost come to fully, or the parasite had almost come to fully consume the host. For that to be kind of hacked back and power derogated, to the people, and moved off the public's books into the private sphere is really something that I think people came to look at as a more just a more dynamic way of doing business, access to capital, lower prices, stability, all that kind of stuff. And then I rambled on a bit here, but the rental law, which Mr. Milei overturned, was just one of these disastrous laws that may have been well-meaning on on the part of the politicians if you're very, very generous, in that it was supposedly designed to protect people who were renting their apartments, their houses off evil capitalists who had who owned the who owned the land or the condo. But what actually happened was, because the restrictions were so tight, the owners of said condominiums or whatever were holding them off the market, and so inventory became extraordinarily tight. Therefore, prices were just out of reach for many of the average Argentines working and middle class Argentines who were looking for a place to live. And so you had this massive market disconnect where the market was just unable to discover a fair price where buyer and seller, or renter and rentee, were able to come to a voluntary agreement. Mr. Milei repealed that, and within a few months, inventory in the city of Buenos Aires shot up by 200%, a non-trivial 200%, meaning prices came down, people were able to start finding homes, the normal kinds of things that you would expect in a free and voluntary market, but which were just considered otherworldly to people who had long suffered the heavy hand of government in their day-to-day dealings. So, yeah, all of the above and much more besides.
That's fascinating. You talk about rent controls there, because I know that in the last, I think it's 6 months to a year, there was murmurings in England about this. Now, I say England very specifically because Scotland had put in rent controls. Now, I think it was on social housing, I think, or it might have been a blanket rent control. My information isn't right off the top of my head. What I do know is there was a very similar issue where people were then complaining that rents have gone up too much, because, of course, if you're restricting basic supply and demand, economics 101, isn't it? What's going to happen if you restrict the supply of something where the demand either remains the same or goes up? Price is going to go up. It's a 2-year-old could tell you that. And what I found interesting was that, again, people were having a go at greedy capitalist landlords, and then all of a sudden, all those people that are running social housing said, well, hang on a minute, we need to increase by more than the rent cap. I think it was a 3% rent cap. We've got to increase by more than that because we cannot keep up with X, Y, and Z, and all the reasons came out. And what fascinates me is that people, and I think that you could argue whether this is media, mainstream media, whatever it might be, people don't seem to be able to connect dots here of, well, hang on a minute, the state's getting involved. This is what's happening. Yeah, my quality of life, or my rent in this case, has shot up or whatever. And people, to me, seem like they're not able to put the dots together. I don't know if that's a sentiment you agree with at all, Joe.
Yeah, I think, I think sometimes it takes a PhD in economics to be able to miss common sense insights that a 2-year-old, as you mentioned, could tell you. I mean, most people understand, sort of basic supply and demand economics, whether they run a fruit store or they mow lawns or they have they cut hair for a living. This is not rocket surgery, as they say, and yet you have to go and get an advanced degree in economics and then go and work for Congress in order to sort of have that scrambled around in your cerebrum. And I do think that the media plays a part in this. I was just having a bit of a chuckle yesterday when I saw a news story. I think maybe it was in Forbes or one of the sort of mainstream outlets, and it was talking about Mr. Musk toying with the idea of sending a $5,000, essentially a rebate check, to every American based on the savings that DOGE had thus far identified in the government. And I was just reading the comments underneath, which if you're sort of, looking for a bit of comedy in your life, the comment section of these under these stories is just absolute gold. And so there are people under there who, whether they're just trolling or whether they actually sort of think this, sometimes a little hard to tell, but their response was, "Oh, so you're trying now to bribe the public?" And I was thinking, wow, is that what you say when you get your tax return? Like, this is your money going back to you in it's like if somebody stole your wallet and then a cab driver found it on the side of the road and brought it back to you, and you were like you're getting annoyed at the taxi driver for having returned your stolen goods. I mean, it's obscene. And no doubt the people who receive that $5,000, and they'll be screaming about it all the way to Best Buy, where they buy themselves a new laptop on which they can order stuff from Amazon that they don't need and what have you. But just the level of kind of cognitive dissonance there, where somebody can say, "Hey, we've identified that your government has misallocated, either willfully or negligently, but in any case incompetently, the money that it first fleeced off of you, and we've identified this, and we're going to give you some of that back." And for somebody to be upset with that, I mean, it begs the question: why don't they just give more of their money to I mean, they could write, a check worth 100% of their salary if they're so concerned about having to, shoulder personal responsibility of managing their own finances. But why don't they just give all their money over to the state and just be done with it immediately, if you want to follow that logic? So yeah, I think the media has something to play in this, but I also think there's a bit of sort of derangement syndrome on the right and the left, where people, they've been conditioned to think that their state is there to take care of them. It's kind of the ultimate in political Stockholm syndrome, where they will defend their captors to the death. That's very sad.
Yeah, it is. I think you make a very good point there about there being a political divide. 'Cause this is what, and not just in the USA. I'm not just going to pick on the USA because it's happening, I think, across most of the world. But I do, for the benefit of people watching YouTube, I'm smiling there because I've read through some of those comments that you were talking about, and are just absolutely hilarious, to be perfectly honest. Yeah, talking of Doge, let's wrap up here or over there in the USA, because one thing that amazed me, and again, you touched on a political divide, so I appreciate that people are just probably arguing with each other just for the sake of it, just because they don't like the fact that Trump's in power or Musk is there or whatever. Efficiency and effectiveness at any walk of life, whether it's government or your local council or even us as individuals, having some form of efficiency and effectiveness is important. So if you continue to spend more than you earn, then that's not going to end up very well, not for you personally or not for a government. So the fact that Doge is going in, by the way, the UK needs a Doge very quickly, but that's a different podcast. Doge has gone in, and they've added themselves onto this US debt clock, which is also good fun to watch if you get bored. Point being, what made me laugh, which I found funny but also sad at the same time, is I think Elon Musk had put up on X a photo of people that were claiming, I think it was Social Security, and someone was in the age bracket of 300 to 40 and 349 years old. So I find it funny, but also sad that somehow the USA or Social Security is seemingly paying Social Security to someone that's older than the country, the United States, in the first place. Anyway, I don't really have a question on that, Joel, but I know you, again, I know that you've written, I'm rambling on now, but I know you've written recently about Doge versus deep state. And again, the USA is such a big and powerful place. But I mean, some of the level of corruption that's going on there is it surely it has to anger people on both sides of the divide there, because it's as you say, it's the government stealing your cash. What's going on?
Yeah, it seems like it would be, something where people could kind of reach harmoniously across the aisle. It would be a bipartisan issue where people would say, "Hey, how about we sort of tighten our, britches a bit? We are $36 trillion in debt after all. That's not an ideal situation for us to be in, especially since we're relying on uh, creditors who may not necessarily have the country's best interest at heart, namely China, that we keep sort of prodding and picking on. They seem to have a fairly large stash of our freshly inked Benjamins in their coffers or their sort of digital safes or what have you abroad. They're going to come back to the US one day, potentially fly back onto the US shores, and then maybe the US will see something like Argentina levels of hyperinflation. I don't know, but yeah, you would think that it would be sort of a bipartisan issue, but it's the old kind of divide and conquer, I think. Once people sort of find themselves in the right-left paradigm, they're not looking at the people who are doing the real fleecing generally. It's insiders versus outsiders, the state versus free people, to my sort of mind. And then the left versus right paradigm is it's typically it's been welfare versus warfare, but it's your dollars being spent by somebody other than you. And I just don't, I can't see how that necessarily has your best interest at heart. You mentioned decentralization at the top of our discussion here. And, that to me does seem, it's just a much more efficient way of harnessing the spontaneous order generated in an economy where you and I can agree to do something, we rent a house, have a podcast, exchange stock, cook an asada, whatever we happen to decide, we only enter into that contract if it's in our mutual interest. And if not, then, we find somebody else to do business with in whatever capacity. But the idea that a centralized brain trust can have the vision, can have the purity of information, be it prices, profit signals, whatnot. Hayek called this the pretense to knowledge, but the idea that some board of genius overlords could know what's in the heart and mind of, in the US, 300 and whatever 50 million people, however many 65 it is in the UK, or 45 million people down here, is just on its face a laughable claim. But yet it's a claim upon which the entire governments of the world is built. And so it's very unsurprising to me that we should suddenly discover that 340-year-old people are being paid Social Security, or that there's tens of millions of people who are over 120 years old, allegedly, who are being paid Social Security. I think there's a couple of $1 trillion that they've identified in payments to people who either should be in the Guinness Book of Records as, and they're living on some island of blissful longevity somewhere, or more likely that this is just fraudulent payments. To me, that's exactly what you would expect, given the state of affairs as it is. And I'll just sort of end on saying, I think we've had 250, call it maybe 300 years in the modern age of building national governments and now international organizations like the UN and the World Health Organization and the EU, and this just massive sort of web of national and now supranational governmental apparatus. And maybe we're approaching the high watermark for those institutions, because the more we dig into them, the more we realize that maybe we don't need this anymore. Maybe we can do a better job of harnessing the technology that is available to us now, that the founders of the US or the kings and queens at the time in the old world couldn't have fathomed, didn't have available to them. And so they decided that they would build centralized states and have standing armies and impose income taxes and all the kinds of things that the founders in the US were warned about and were afraid of. They all sort of came to fruition. And now we have, we didn't even touch on sort of censorship across Europe and just the myriad of other toxic government problems that exist around the world. Maybe this is the time when we start peeling back a few of those layers and deciding, that's not for us, and we can maybe do a little better, if not a lot.
I would hope so. I really would hope so. I think maybe censorship on Europe and so forth, maybe leave that until towards the end of 2025. Maybe we can catch up and see what's going on around the world a bit later on in the year. Just before we wrap up, we mentioned at the start a recent online conference that you've done. Are there any plans to have another one? And if so, how can people find out more about that should the next one be happening?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for that. Our first conference of the year was in early January. As I mentioned, it was investing in the end of the world. So my Substack is Notes from the End of the World. And what we did is we invited three of my favorite macro thinkers and investors, Rick Rule, Eric Fry, and Byron King, on to speak about what they saw happening down here in Argentina from an investment standpoint. We recorded that event. We did it live. We had about 3,000 people register for it, which we're very happy with for our first event. We learned a few things on the technical side, we think we could do a better job next time. So we have the full audio video recordings, as well as a complete transcript up on my Substack. So Notes from the End of the World members can check that out, even if they weren't able to attend live. And the idea is, going forward, we're going to have these events quarterly. So the next one is tentatively penciled in for early April. I've got a few really exciting speakers lined up, people that I'm really excited to speak with and to kind of get their take on what's happening down here. Crisis on one side, opportunity on the other, as always. So I would say to your readers, if they're interested in following what's going on down here at the end of the world, they can head over to Substack and look at joelbowman.substack.com. You'll find my Notes from the End of the World newsletter there. And yeah, we'll send out some more information about the April conference in due course. And again, these will be quarterly through the year. So you'll be able to sign up and hear what our guests have to say. And then if you want some recordings and things like that afterwards, there are some membership benefits for those who are interested.
Fantastic. No, thank you for explaining that. So I was there online in January. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I took a lot of information from there. So I'd highly recommend people do go and check that out. For the benefit of people watching this on YouTube, or if you're listening on podcasts, whatever it might be, again, joelbowman.substack.com, Notes from the End of the World. Or if you happen to head over to contrariancapitalist.substack.com, again, I will link everything as best as possible in the accompanying notes. So I'll link to yourself, Joel, as well. So everyone's a winner. Well, thank you very much. I think that's, I learned a lot from this as well. I think the perception of what's happening in Argentina when you're not in Argentina seems to be slightly different from what's the perception is within Argentina itself. But I think that's probably fair to say from any country in the world. So thank you for taking your time today. Really learned a lot, and look forward to hopefully catching up at the back end of 2025, and then we can deal with topic 2, which is censorship in Europe.
Yeah, another can of worms. Robert, thanks so much for having me on the show today, mate. And I appreciate the time from your audience, listeners, readers, etc. Thanks a lot.